Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Chapter 18, Dobby's Reward. For a moment there was a silence as Harry, Ron, Ginny, and Locker stood at the doorway covered in muck and slime and blood. Then there was a scream. "Ginny!" It was Mrs. Weasley, who had been sitting crying in front of the fire. She leapt to her feet, closely followed by Mr. Weasley, and both of them flung themselves on their daughter. Harry, however, was looking past them. Professor Dumbledore was standing by the mantelpiece, beaming next to Professor McGonagall, who was talking great studying gasp, clutching her chest. Fox went whooshing past Harry's ear and settled on Dumbledore's shoulder, just as Harry found himself and Ron being swept into Mrs. Weasley's tight embrace. "You saved her! You saved her! How did you do it?" "I think we'd all like to know that," said Professor McGonagall weakly. Mrs. Weasley let go of Harry, who hesitated for a moment, then walked over the desk and laid a spoon in the sorting hat, the ruby encrusted sword, and what remained of Riddle's diary. Then he started telling them everything. For nearly a quarter of an hour, he spoke into the rapt silence. He told them about hearing the disembodied voice, how Hermione had finally realized that he was hearing a basilisk in the pipe, how he and Ron had followed the spiders into the forest that Aragog had told them where the last victim of basilisk had died, how he guessed that Moaning Myrtles had been the victim, and the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets might be her bathroom. "Very well," Professor McGonagall pumped him as he paused. "So you found out where the entrance was, breaking 100 schoolgirls into pieces along the way, I might add. But how on earth did you get out of there alive, Potter?" So Harry, his voice now growing hoarse from all this talking, told them about Fox timely arrived and about the sorting hat giving him the sword. But then he faltered. He had so far avoided mentioning Riddle's diary or Ginny. She was standing with her head against Mrs. Weasley's shoulder, and tears were still coursing silently down her cheeks. What if they expelled her? Harry thought in panic. Riddle's diary didn't work anymore. How could they prove it has been he who made her do it all? Instinctively, Harry looked at Dumbledore, who smiled faintly. The firelight glanced of his half-moon spectacles. "What interests me most," said Dumbledore gently, "is how Lord Voldemort managed to enchant Ginny when my sources tell me he is currently in hiding in the forest of Albania." Relief, warm, sweeping, glorious relief, swept over Harry. What, Dad?" said Mr. Weasley in a stone voice. "You know who? Enchant Ginny, but Ginny's not has been, was she?" "It was this diary," said Harry quick, picking it up up and showing it to Dumbledore. "Riddle wrote it when he was 16. Dumbledore took the diary from Harry and peered neatly down his long crooked nose and its burnt and soggy pieces. "Brilliant," he said softly. Of course, he was probably the most brilliant student Hogwarts had ever seen. He turned around to the Weasleys, who were looking utterly bewildered. "Very few people know that Lord Voldemort was once called Tom Riddle. I thought to myself, 5 years ago. Afterward, he disappeared after leaving the school, traveled far and wide, sank so deeply into the dark earth, concerted with the very worst of our kind, underwent so many dangerous, magical transformations that when he refused as Voldemort, with the clever, handsome boy who has once had boy here. But Ginny, said Mrs. Weasley, what's our Ginny got to do with him? His diary, Ginny sobbed. I've been writing in it, and he's been writing back all year. Ginny, said Mrs. Weasley. What should... Ginny, said Mr. Weasley, flabbergasting. Haven't I told you anything? What have I always told you? Never trust anything that can think for itself if you couldn't see where it keeps its brain. Why didn't you show the diary to me or your mother? A suspicious object like that, it was clearly full of dark magic. I didn't know, said Ginny. I found it inside one of the books Mom got me. I thought someone had just left it there and forgotten about it. Miss Weasley should go up to the hospital wing right away. Dumbledore interrupted in a firm voice. This has been a troubled ordeal for her. There will be no punishment older and wiser wizard than she have been. Hoodwinked by Lord Voldemort. He strode over the door and opened it. Backrests, or perhaps a large steaming mug of hot chocolate. I always find that cheers me up, he added, twinkling kindly down at her. You will find Madame Pomfrey is still awake. She's just giving a mundrages. I dare say the basilisk victims will be waking up any moment. So her mind is okay, said Ron brightly. There has no lasting harm done, Ginny. Said Dumbledore. Mr. Weasley let Ginny out, and Mr. Weasley followed, still looking deeply shaken. You know, Minerva, Professor Dumbledore said thoughtfully to Professor McGonagall, I think all this merits a good feast. Might I ask you to go and alert the kitchens? Right? Said Professor McGonagall crisply, also moving to the door. I'll leave you to deal with Potter and Weasley, shall I? Certainly, said Dumbledore. She laughed, and Harry and Ron gazed uncertainly at Dumbledore. What exactly had Professor McGonagall meant? Deal with them? Surely they weren't about to be punished. I seem to remember telling you both that I would have expelled you if you broke any more school rules, said Dumbledore. Ron opened his mouth in horror, which goes to show that the best of us must sometimes eat our words. Dumbledore went on, smiling. You will both receive special awards for service to the school. And let me see. Yes, I think 200 points apiece for Gryffindor. Ron went as brightly pink as Lockhart Valentine flowers and closed his mouth again. But one of us seemed to be keeping mildly quiet about his part in this dangerous adventure. Dumbledore added, Why so mooded, Gilderoy? He gave a start. He had completely forgotten about Lockhart. He turned and saw that Lockhart was standing in the corner of the room, still wearing his baggy smile. When Dumbledore addressed him, Lockhart looked over his shoulder to see who he was talking to. Professor Dumbledore, Ron said quickly. There was an accident down in the Chamber of Secrets, Professor Lockhart. And my professor, said Lockhart in a mild surprise. Goodness, I expect I was hopeless, was I? He tried to do a memory charm, and the one backfired. Ron explained quietly to Dumbledore. Dear me, said Dumbledore, shaking his hand, his long silver moustache quivering. Impales upon your own sword, Gilderoy. Sword? Said Lockhart dimly. Haven't got a sword. That boy has, though. He pointed at Harry. He'll lend you one. Would you mind taking Professor Lockhart up to the infirmary, too? Dumbledore said to Ron. I'd like to a few more words with Harry. Lockhart ambled out. Ron cast a curious look back at Dumbledore and Harry as he closed the door. Dumbledore crossed to one of the chairs by the fire. Sit down, Harry, he said, and Harry sat, feeling unaccountably nervous. First of all, Harry, I want to thank you, said Dumbledore, eyes twinkling again. You must have shown me the real royalty down in the chamber. Nothing but that could have called Fox to you. He struck the phoenix, which had fluttered down onto his knee. Harry grinned awkwardly as Dumbledore watched him. And so you met Tom Riddle, said Dumbledore thoughtfully. I imagine he was most interested in you. Suddenly something that was nagging at Harry came tumbling out his mouth. Professor Dumbledore, Riddle said, I'm like him. Strange likeness, he said. Did he? Now? Said Dumbledore, looking thoughtfully at Harry from under his thick silver eyebrows. And what do you think, Harry? I don't think I'm like him, said Harry more loudly than he'd intended. I mean, I'm in Gryffindor, and I'm... But he fell silent, a lurking doubt resurfacing his mind. Professor, he stirred again after a moment. The sorting had told me I'd have done well in Slytherin. Everyone thought I was Slytherin's here for a while because I can speak Puzzletongue. You can speak Puzzletongue, Harry, said Dumbledore calmly, because Lord Voldemort, who is the last remaining descendant of Salazar Slytherin, can speak Puzzletongue. Unless I'm much mistaken, he transferred some of his own powers to you the night he gave you the scar. Not something he intended to do, I'm sure. Voldemort put a bit of himself in me? Harry said, thunderstruck. It certainly seems so. So I should be in Slytherin, Harry said, looking desperately into Dumbledore's face. The Sorting Hat should see Slytherin's power in me, and it put you in Gryffindor, said Dumbledore calmly. Listen to me, Harry. You happen to have many qualities of Salazar Slytherin, prized and his hand-picked students. His own very rare gift, Puzzletongue, resourcefulness, determined a certain Sorting Hat place you in Gryffindor. You know why that was, think. It only put me in Gryffindor, said Harry in a defeated voice, because I asked not to go in Slytherin. Exactly, said Dumbledore, beaming once more. Which makes you very different from Tom Riddle. It is our choice, Harry. That shows what we truly are, far more than your abilities, Harry said, motionless in his chair, stunned. If you want proof, Harry, that you belong in Gryffindor, I suggest to look more closely at this. Dumbledore reached across the Professor McGonagall's desk, picked up the blue blood-stained silver sword, and handed it to Harry. Duly, Harry turned it over, the rubies blazing in the firelight. And then he saw the name engraved just below the hilt. Godric Gryffindor. Only a true Gryffindor could have pulled that out of the hat, Harry, said Dumbledore simply. For a minute, neither of them spoke. The professor pulled open one of the drawers in Professor McGonagall's desk and took out a quill and bottle of ink. What you need, Harry, is some food and sleep. I suggest you to go down at the feast while I write to Azkaban. We need our gamekeeper back. And I must draft an advertisement for the Daily Prophet too. He added thoughtfully, we'll be needing a new defense against the dark arts teacher. Dear me, we do seem so run through them, don't we? Harry got up and crossed to the door. He just had reached for the handle. However, then the door burst open so violently that it bounced back off the wall. Lucius Malfoy stood there, fury in his face, and cowering behind his neck, heavily wrapped in bandage, was Dobby. Good evening, Lucius, said Dumbledore pleasantly. Mr. Malfoy almost knocked Harry over, and he swept into the room. Dobby went scurrying in after him. Crouching at the helm of the clock, a look of abject terror on his face. The elf was carrying a stained rag with which he was attempting to finish cleaning Mr. Malfoy's shoes. Apparently, Mr. Malfoy had set out in a great hurry. For not only were his shoes half polished, but he usually sleek care was disheveled. Ignoring the elf bubbling apologetical around his ankle, he fixed his cold eyes upon Dumbledore. So, he said, you've come back. The governess suspended you, but you still so fit to return to Hogwarts.